Welcome back to the show. My guest today is Dr. Stephanie Fitzgerald. Stephanie is a chartered clinical psychologist, neuropsychologist, keynote speaker, and published author. Stephanie is founder of Soyo Ltd, a company designed to help individuals and organizations achieve their highest and happiest potential. So as you'll hear in our conversation, Stephanie has worked as a health and wellbeing consultant across varied industries. So she's worked with Deloitte, the NHS, emergency response teams, all the way through to a Premier League football team. Well, actually, they were still a Premier League team at the time of recording anyway. So we cover a lot of interesting areas in this chat, and not least the global mental health strategy that Stephanie developed for an organization with 45,000 employees. That's really interesting. Keep an ear out for that one. So let's get straight into my conversation with Dr. Stephanie Fitzgerald. Stephanie, hello and welcome to the Work Well podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
It's a pleasure. It's a real pleasure. Tell us, how are you? How is life and work for you at the moment?
Yeah, life is good, thank you. It's busy, but it always is, so we just go with that. But yeah, things are pretty good at the moment, thank you. How about you?
Really good, thank you. Yeah, really good. Again, busy. Wouldn't have it any other way. You know, life moves on. The family life is busy. Work life is busy. So, but absolutely wouldn't have it any other way. Tell us that. So, you've had a really interesting career, Stephanie. Could you maybe share with us how you were drawn to your area of work first of all, and maybe some career highlights?
Yeah, absolutely. So I definitely haven't followed the traditional clinical psychologist path. I think that's fair to say. So, but my interest in the work definitely started. So I worked in the NHS as a trainee clinical psychologist, and you do different rotations and you have different placements and so on and so forth. And I worked in a fantastic ward as a trainee, and then I qualified and I went back to be a neuropsychologist, which is my specialism. And I just really noticed a change in the team. I noticed a change in morale. I noticed a change, just everything felt so different. In the space of maybe less than a year, everything had changed. And it was at a really tough time for the NHS. I mean, you know, the NHS is constantly under resource pressure and so on and so forth. But I've really found myself thinking, we're so patient focused, quite rightly. That's why we do what we do. But I just could not understand why no one was looking after the staff in a more holistic way. And you've got to remember, you know, not to age myself, but this was 10, 15 years ago. This was not at a time when people were talking about workplace wellbeing very openly, and certainly not in healthcare settings. There was a kind of toughen up approach, you know, it's just part of the job. And at the time, David Cameron was in government. So this really is aging me now. But he was leading something called the Big Conversation. And the idea was that if you were a public health worker, you could submit ideas that you thought would save money, and you could start a big conversation. And I piloted a staff wellbeing program, and we were the only program in the UK that was focusing on wellbeing. So all the other sectors were focusing on patient care, or, you know, even things like light switches that would automatically go off if no one was on the ward, those kind of innovations. And I said, actually, I really think there's something in taking care of our people. And what we found at the end of that pilot was that actually, if you take good care of your doctors and nurses, patients get better quicker. And there are lots of reasons for that, you know, so even just things like patient handover is more consistent because the same doctors and nurses are on the wards rather than people dropping in and out. But we had quite high sickness absence, and it was something that I really wanted to see. Can we help support? And since that initial research, there's been so much research saying, yes, if you take care of your staff, then people leave hospital quicker and healthier, and they have better care, but also doctors and nurses are happier. And I'm not going to lie, I was hooked. And up until that point, I was really focused on individual therapy, really supporting individuals. And I suddenly thought, wow, I can help a whole group of people. If I can do that on one ward, maybe I can do that in a whole hospital. And if I could do it in a whole hospital, maybe I could do it in a whole trust. So I started to do some consultancy for the NHS, really looking at workplace wellbeing. And then I don't know what it says about me, because they say your vibe attracts your tribe, but I really moved into safety critical industries where health issues are safety issues, and started to talk to them about health and wellbeing. And again, at a time when no one was having that conversation, so it was a bit of an uphill battle. But again, you find yourself, instead of helping one person, you might reach 1,000 people and keep people safe and well at work. And I was hooked. So that was sort of my path into it, really.
Excellent. It's unfortunate, isn't it? But so often it's the industries or the areas where, you know, people are responsible for the health and well-being of others, but they neglect, or their own well-being is neglected. That's so often the case, isn't it?
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's such a challenge, I think, for people to remember themselves, because I always say to people, start by stopping and check in with yourself. How are you doing? Because we've lost the art. And I think if you're in a customer facing business, or if you're in a patient facing business, whatever it may be, if you've got someone that you're deliverable, that you're accountable to and you're delivering for, when someone says, how are you, Brian? What you're thinking is, you know, is my caseload okay? Are my patients okay? Have I done ward rounds okay? Is everyone on? You're not thinking about you. You're almost going through a checklist. And if everything's okay, then you think, well, I must be okay. So we've lost that art. I think we've lost the art of checking in with ourselves. Yeah.
And what happened next then? Were you working with the NHS consulting to these other organizations, or did you leave the NHS and work directly with these organizations?
Yeah, so I left the NHS, but I stayed in touch and was still working both with individuals on a kind of more therapeutic basis and small teams, but also doing wider trust-wide consultancy, which was really interesting, because you're suddenly on the other side of the table thinking about different staff initiatives and things. But I went to work for the Rail Safety Standards Board, and I was their health and wellbeing lead for about 3 years there. And again, in the background, my own consultancy was building up, and I found that I was being pulled into so many different industries. People were just starting to wake up and have that conversation around workplace wellbeing. And I think I'm a bit of a rare breed in that I have a clinical background and I'm a qualified clinician, and I keep that side of my skill set very much active. But then I was someone that had 5 and then 10 and then 15 years of corporate experience behind them, who was able to share the evidence-based best practice, but also the commercial angle of how do we make this work for an organization of 5,000, 10,000, 15,000 people. So that really pulled me into there. And I've really been quite blessed with the variety of industry I've worked in. So I've worked from everything from Premier football clubs through to finance, through to emergency response workers. I've really sort of opened doors, and it's amazing to see all these industries catch up with the conversation. And I always get really excited. I say to people, I feel like I watched a box set 10 years ago, and I've been desperate to talk about it, and now everyone's seen the program, so we could all discuss it together.
That's a nice way of summarizing it. Yeah. And you mentioned, I couldn't help notice, all right, on the CV, Everton Football Club. Tell me about the work you were doing with Everton.
Yeah, so really interesting. Not least, I think I mentioned this to you. My other half is quite an ardent Liverpool supporter. So
nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that.
So there was a bit of tension to negotiate, not least because he actually dropped me off at the Everton ground. I think that was particularly painful for him. But no, it was fantastic. So actually, So I've done a few different pieces with Everton, but the ones that really stick out for me were with some of the community work that Everton leads on, and certainly in quite deprived areas. And they really offer a lifeline to people, you know, whether that's very practical financial support or community support, giving people more of a family to belong to. You know, it's a very community-minded club. And what I was noticing when I was working with them was the people that were doing the community work were so busy looking after everyone else, a bit like we were saying earlier,
right,
that no one was looking after them. They were forgetting to take care of their own well-being. And so they might be supporting families, you know, in real hardship or with significant mental health challenges or physical illnesses. And then coming away from that, you know, they weren't qualified clinicians. They didn't have the benefit of supervision or anything like that. They were just people who were trying to do their best. And so I was really there to support them, to make sure they were looking after themselves.
Very good. So it's a program run by the club to support the local community.
Yes, yeah, exactly that. Yes.
Very good. Yeah. And I think in your most recent role, like a really interesting role with Rolls-Royce, you developed the global mental health strategy.
I did, yes.
Tell us about that.
So my role, you know, it was during a very challenging time. So, you know, I think I'd been with Rolls-Royce for a few months, maybe just 7-8 months, something like that. And then the pandemic hit. And so I definitely didn't see a global pandemic and supported people through a global pandemic as part of the strategy when I joined. That wasn't in my planning. But really, you know, Rolls-Royce had 50,000 employees plus when I joined, and
huge organization,
huge global organization.
People are familiar with obviously the cars, certainly the old school cars, but also the airplane aviation engines. But there's quite a bit more as well, isn't there?
Yeah, so loads of strands. So it's funny, actually. It was the question I was most often asked was, do you get a company car? You know, do you get a
Rolls-Royce Phantom?
Can you imagine just rocking up in that?
Yeah.
So sadly, no. But, you know, predominantly we were a civil aerospace business.
Sure.
And so we made airplane engines, and no one was flying a plane. And no one was traveling, and you know, orders that were in were you know, being cancelled, and it was a very, very difficult time. And actually part of my role was to support globally, not just our COVID response, and I worked with a fantastic team and who really led the way on that, but also supporting people with the restructuring that followed. So it's no state secret, it was all over the press, which was quite painful at the time. We lost nearly 20% of our workforce, which was the biggest ever restructure Rolls-Royce has been through as a company. And that was, you know, immensely challenging for all the reasons that you'd imagine, but also the stress and pressure that left on people who remained. So it was a really, really challenging time. And I often think, you know, there's a real sense of right place, right time. And I think, my goodness, if ever they needed a global lead for mental health, it was during that time. And then, of course, as we started to move through and the vaccination program was rolled out, etc., the job kind of returned to normal, if I can put it that way. But certainly felt like I was there at the right time. But I was with Rolls for just over 3 years, and it definitely felt closer to 10, just in terms of the experience and the everything that we went through as a company. You know, it's been a hell of a time.
There can be, you know, during a restructuring, understandably the focus is on those that are leaving and supporting them. We can often neglect the people that remain, can't we? And say, well, we can't do anything for you. We've just gone through this massive restructuring. You know, you're lucky to have a job. There can often be that attitude. But I think that's almost needed the most important time to do something and provide supports for those colleagues.
Absolutely. And I will say, so my priority when we went into COVID was absolutely, I think you need to be able to take that step back and think, hold on, what's going on? So the first people I reached out to in the organization were IT, because I knew they'd be absolutely slammed trying to get everyone organized with remote working and, all our different VPNs and everything else, and so it's kind of, are you okay? Is anyone looking after you? What's your strategy to take care of yourselves? How's your working day looking? Similarly, with the shop floor, people were having to still come in because they had the kinds of jobs in manufacturing where you can't work from home. So how are we making sure that we're taking care of everyone's well-being? That was really important to me. And then again, supporting HR colleagues, because they were obviously having to lead through, supporting procurement colleagues. They were having to take people through redundancy packages, that sort of thing. So it's so important to be able to not get pulled into the busy and where all the noise is, and be able to take a step back and say, okay, hold on, we need to take care of everyone in the organization who might be struggling at the moment.
Excellent. Yeah, very important. And tell us more about, just more details on how you actually went about developing or implementing the strategy, because I think there was, if I'm not mistaken, there was a mental health first aid program there previously. I don't think that's something you continued with.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so some quite big changes. So I will say, I think my approach was very much to go back to basics, back to what I know works, and back to a very strongly evidence-based best practice approach. And that's what I'd recommend for any company, regardless of size, regardless of what have you. And mental health first aid, I think, is a wonderful initiative, and it's started lots of conversations, and it's really raised awareness. But what we needed, and what I needed in the company, was a group of individuals who would support the delivery of the strategy. So mental health first aid is a 2-day training which advises you around having conversations around mental health. But it wasn't company specific. So it didn't teach people, for example, about the medical legal challenges that can face a global company. So for example, if you and I were in the US and you had a day off sick, I'm not allowed to ask you why you were off sick. Okay. Same in Germany. So the things that make you a good, kind, caring manager in the UK actually have legal complications in the US and Germany. Right. And so you can't really have a generic training for mental health champions. Sure. Because they might have a global team, and they may think, great, let's have an activity where we take 15 minutes and ask each other all about our mental health. And there'll be colleagues in that room who culturally that's not appropriate, but also legally that's not appropriate. And they may feel very uncomfortable with the position you're putting them in, even though you're trying to do something super, great intentions, and you're just trying to be supportive. So we really moved to a much more company-specific internal training program, which we designed. And the other thing that I was really keen on was that people volunteer for this role. People volunteer to be a mental health champion. And I wanted them to feel they were getting something out of it. So the other thing I developed was a rolling curriculum with different topics, so that people constantly felt they were being upskilled and able to have these conversations. But also, if there was a topic of interest, that there was training available to them, so that they felt, actually, I'm getting something out of this role. I'm being developed. I'm enjoying my role. I'm learning more. And I really found that was the best way to keep people engaged in the role and to enjoy it. That was my ultimate thing, because I was asking them to kind of help me, and I couldn't financially reward them. So I wanted them to feel rewarded in other ways. So we set up a really strong community of practice and learning and development program, which I highly recommend as a way of keeping people engaged, keeping them up to date with the latest information, but also just building that community.
Very good. Yeah, that's really important, isn't it? That ongoing learning and support and community. It's not just a one-off training. It's ongoing, and you're learning. You're constantly learning. You're sharing ideas, lessons learned with your colleagues, and I'm sure in different parts of the world. Was there any specific, say, country-specific training or support, or was it all kind of done at the global level?
So definitely, as part of that global training, you'd have region-specific training. So our champions would train specifically around the conversations and the do's and don'ts for the US and Germany, but also our champions would support training for each other. So just culturally, people would, we've got big sites in Singapore and in China and in Japan, and people were really able to share. It's very easy when you've got a UK headquarters to get very UK-centric centric and everything's sort of designed for the UK. And our colleagues were really fantastic at supporting me and being able to upskill the champions to understand, actually, culturally, we might not have that kind of conversation, but we might talk about this instead, or we might introduce this element. That would be a lot more comfortable in a team meeting than just starting a conversation about mental health. So we really try to make sure that people felt part of the global organization, and that they recognized within teams they were going to meet people from all different regions, all different cultural expectations, and that they needed to be there to support everyone. Certainly when I joined Rolls-Royce, I remember saying to one of the board members, well, it's okay to not be okay as long as you're in the UK, because everything felt very UK centric. So I made it was a real passion project of mine that from day one, I wanted everything to be globally applicable. And I'm very proud of the work that we did there.
Excellent. Yeah, and it sounds like just a great learning experience all around. I mean, I've heard of some other international companies that they might have something the equivalent of a TED Talk, where someone might give, and it could be about any subject. But quite often it's let's say an employee in Singapore just giving a 10-minute their own take on Singapore, some of the tourist attractions, some of the cultural differences, this kind of idea. It's just a really nice way to learn. So I'd imagine you kind of had that learning, that kind of group dynamic going on in the team.
Absolutely. And I think as well, people would often share how something had landed in their team so that other teams could learn from that. So quite often our champions would present back to managers and say, I led this initiative in my team, and this is what went well, this is what I'd change, this is what I'd recommend, this is what I'd maybe leave out. Because really we wanted our managers to feel confident taking this forward as well. So that was really helpful. Very good.
Like workplace well-being is a continuous improvement process, isn't it? So that's absolutely at the heart of what you're doing there. ISO 45003 was probably published after you had set up the program. Is there anything there in that I don't know? Have you taken anything from it? Do you think it's a useful standard for organizations going forward?
Do you know, I really do. I have to say I'm a product fan. I think it's a really good standard. I think what's so fantastic about it is that it's the sister standard to something that many organizations were already using. And so what I really liked about it was that even the basics, like the format and the language and the structure of it, mirrored what people were already very familiar with. And I think at a time when we were probably all quite fatigued by lots of change, lots of uncertainty, lots of, because this was published right in the midst of everything going on with the pandemic. I think it just provided this really beautiful framework that people could very quickly wrap their heads around, because it was very familiar to them. It wasn't being imposed on them. It wasn't someone saying, you've got to go away and do this. It was, these are our recommendations. This is what we think works well. This is what the evidence base says. And it's quite gentle in terms of, I don't think there's anything in that standard that you'd look at and go, gosh, that's really, that's a 20-year project, that's really out of reach for most organizations. All of it is common sense approach. What I really liked about it, like I say, was that it gave a structure at a time when people didn't really have the headspace to maybe think and get those kind of creative juices flowing. They almost just needed a standard to say, this is what good looks like, go away and do this. And then people are, okay, got it. I can go and do that. And that feels really achievable and that feels really doable. And of course, you can always build, right? A standard is not meant to be, well, this is gold standard and you can never develop it. It's meant to be, in my mind, a starting framework that you build within. But yeah, I think that will make a huge difference. And I think particularly, not many organizations now are at the starting point of their journey. I do think we're past that point. I'm very rarely now get asked to consult for companies who just were starting from scratch and like, we don't know how to build a wellbeing strategy. But I think what the standard does is it gets rid of some of that, what I call the lettuce in the canteen and yoga on the lawn approach. So the kind of stuff that looks good on Instagram, but doesn't actually, that's not a strategy. They're beneficial to employees and they're good initiatives, but it's not a strategy. Whereas I think the standard provides a framework that you could really start to organize a strategy around.
I agree with you 100%. The question is the standard. I'm certainly seeing that a lot of companies that are familiar with other ISO standards are, I mean, they think this is fantastic. They're extremely used to the format and the structure. Also, and the larger companies then have resources that they can commit to working on this. I don't know if you have consulted with, or if you were approached by, let's say, a smaller organization who are not familiar with or don't have a history or tradition of ISO standards. Would it work then? Would it be a bit more of a challenge? How do you think that might fare out?
I definitely think it could work, but I think I would present it slightly differently, because I think ISO standards are very specific in the way that they're, and I think if you're familiar with them, you can kind of glance at them and go like, oh yeah, okay, I know what this is saying. I think if you're not familiar with them, they can be quite an overwhelming document. And particularly if you're not in a safety critical industry where you're very used to reviewing safety standards, even the word standards can feel quite confronting, and people are like, oh, I don't know, standard against whom, or, what's my comparison? So for me, I mean, I always think language is so important anyway. And I think you should always be adjusting your language to who you speak to and who you're trying to engage with. So for me, I don't think it would work as a blanket. There you go, there's your standard, off you go. But I think some of the key principles in there are solid. And in my eyes, it's a solid foundation rather than an aspiration. So it's like, actually, if you've got these things in place, you're off to a cracking start, but you've got loads of space to be creative and imaginative and make it your own and build it into your own company, whether you're a small office of 5 people or a massive organization. I think you've got ways of building the core principles in. You might just change your approach and how you interpret that standard.
Very good. Yeah. And speaking of the approach, how do you approach companies? Let's say you see them with the and thankfully there's fewer and fewer, but it's the yoga on the lawn, and was it the letters in the canteen? How would you like, so a company maybe they've got a really good EAP program and they have mental health first aiders, so they've got some tertiary supports, secondary supports. How would you encourage them though to get to the preventative issues, to really tackle the psychosocial hazards in the workplace? How would you move them from the lawn to that, or would you have any ideas in that regard?
Yeah, definitely. So it's something I'm quite passionate about. So a lot of the things that you've talked about, there's quite a significant cost associated with them. Like, it costs to train mental health first aiders, it costs to give people free fruit and subsidized gym membership. And actually the research doesn't support that. And I find that when you're speaking to decision makers, they want data and they want research. And they want evidence. So I will always lead from an evidence-based approach, but I always start with, these are the things that the research says works, and they're free. So actually restructuring an HR policy to make life easier doesn't cost you anything. It's a few hours of HR time, but you don't need to invest in, great big expensive training or initiatives. It's a few hours of time. Meaningful union consultation, it's time. That's what it's costing you, is time. And so I really like to go in with, these are the things that we know will work and will save you money, because that's often the way to get the ears pricked up, and people are like, okay, yes, saving money, that's good. But also, not that I go in there and kind of tear apart what they've got, but unless they're really attached to what they're doing, I think steering people towards an evidence-based, best practice, clinical practice around mental health is so important, but also understanding the objective. So I think a lot of companies go in thinking, oh, people are stressed, we need to make them not stressed anymore. And it's like, okay,
1 hour stress workshop.
Yeah, exactly. We'll run a stress workshop. We'll do some, I mean, horrible term, but we'll make people more resilient.
I know.
And it's like, okay, that's not a strategy. That's you picking one thing. So I'm really trying to get people into the strategic thinking. So for me, the baseline is, what are you trying to do? Because if a company says to me, well, all our people are under increased stress, it's like, okay, so what can we do to make them less stressed? And I'm like, what can you do to empower them to make themselves less stressed? Should be your starting point. So work shouldn't harm you and you shouldn't harm work. That's the kind of basic, like, do no harm principle that I work with. So you shouldn't be doing anything that puts your employees in danger. So if your stress is so high, so let's take a manufacturing facility, if your production target is so high that people are not taking adequate rest, they're coming into work when maybe they shouldn't be, they're not well enough, or they're sleep deprived or something like that, and they're going to be putting their health at risk, your responsibility is to make sure that you're not putting that kind of pressure on people, and that you've got processes in place where people can stop a process if they're not safe. But what our role isn't to do is make sure everyone is super, hyper happy and healthy and engaged and all the rest of it, because actually we can't control that. We need to make sure that people are engaged in their work and they like what they do, and that we're not doing anything to minimize that. But we want to make sure that actually they're not. I'm so sorry, the window cleaner's just arrived outside. I'm sorry, it's banging away. That's typical. Sorry, Brian.
That's fine.
He's just done mine. Sorry, it just started banging against the window. How typical is that? Sorry, may I start that one again? Sorry.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. We could hardly notice you. You can keep going.
Oh, bless you. It's just typical timing, isn't it? Yeah, my apologies. I've lost my train of thought entirely now as well. Apologies.
You were talking about the importance of, I guess, the evidence-based research. You always kind of go back to. Just want. Do you have any particular bodies of evidence or specific research that you go to, or does it depend on who you're working with?
So I'm always upskilling myself. I think that's something I take real pride in. So I really like the latest innovations in mental health, like the latest research, what's the latest thing, as long as it's got a strong evidence base behind it. But for me, I think if you're going with mental health best practice, for example, stick with what's clinical best practice. So, what are the nice guidance recommendations? What is it that we're telling others, to do, the specialists? What's the research that they adhere to? And then look at how can I implement that in my own company? How can I change that for my own organization in a way that's going to land and that's going to be really effective. And I think if you go back to that baseline of what does good look like, what does excellent look like, and where do we want to pitch? And I think the other thing for me that organizations really benefit from, and actually as my colleague Katie's always really good at reminding us about this, is don't get stuck in the situation you're in. So often when we are trying to problem solve, we think within the limitations of where we are. So let's say if you and I only have a budget of £1,000 for something, we might think, oh, this would be amazing. Oh, but we've only got £1,000. Oh, this would be wonderful. Oh, but we've only got £1,000, so we can't do that. Oh, I'd love to do this. Oh, we don't have the budget. And what she's really good at reminding us is, but if best practice looks like £8,000, don't limit your thinking to 1,000. Still aim for the higher, but think, how do I integrate that in a way that's manageable within my organization? What can I take from the gold option, even if I've only got a bronze budget? Sure. So I think that's really important when you're sort of starting to talk to companies about their strategies, that you don't get caught up in their current problems, because otherwise you don't go anywhere, because they'll say things like, oh, the culture's not quite right, or the structure's not quite right, or something, and you think, okay, so let's pretend it is right. What could we aim for then? And then how do we start to play that?
Very good. Yeah. And so the external data, the research, really important. Do you also then, when you're working with an organization, I'm guessing you encourage them to gather their own internal data as well, rather than the very well-intentioned leaders who think stress is on the rise, who think we need to do something in X, Y, and Z? Do you also encourage them to gather their own internal data, baseline data? And if so, how do you do? Any particular tools maybe you'd recommend?
Yeah, I think it's so important. Often I ask people to think outside the box when it comes to wellbeing data. So wellbeing is notoriously difficult to measure if you want a strict ROI, so kind of return on investment wellbeing measure. Often companies will say to me, Stephanie, if we give you a budget of, I don't know, let's say 250,000 for a big organization, you've got £250,000. What kind of return investment can you guarantee us for that? And it always makes me smile, because I think actually, if I try and take a snapshot of your stress, for example, there are so many variables that will not be Steph related, or hopefully anyway, that would not be up to me to control, because I have no control over your external life. I have no control over you. We can't control that. And so if it was, right, Stephanie, here's your budget, then measure everyone's stress level at baseline, then measure them again. Oh, stress hasn't gone down nearly enough, so we'll bin that idea off. It's really managing expectations and saying, actually, if you do well-being well and you measure it well, things will look worse before they look better. Because once you're measuring stress and pressure risk assessments, for example, then actually, once you start measuring those risks, you'll see them, and suddenly you'll be aware of them, and suddenly there's going to be a lot of them. So you may start measuring risk and think, oh my goodness, this is terrible. But it's meant to be that way because you're doing more measurements. And then once you've got an accurate baseline, and we know things like sickness absence are not good indicators of well-being, because we know that the data is skewed, it's underreported, it's not well reported, it's not accurately reported, so on and so forth. And these seem to be problems across industries, across different companies. So I like to kind of think outside the box, and I might say to companies, look at your safety data, because happy, healthy, safe and engaged employees don't have accidents. And kind of happy, healthy, safe and engaged is my tagline. So, if people say, what does a wellbeing consultant do? I say, well, if your employees aren't happy, healthy, safe and engaged, I help you with that. So for me, if you look at your safety data, you can really map when bad things are happening to people, they'll have more slips, trips and falls. The kind of accidents that get overlooked, but are precursors to bigger safety critical incidents. So I really like to encourage people to try and think outside the box and stop trying to measure how happy is everyone. And the other thing that I really steer organizations away from is measuring anything that's to do with a kind of actual diagnostic assessment tool. So often very well-meaning companies will say, well, we want to measure everyone's mood and see how depressed people are. And that's a very dangerous space to get into unless you're a qualified health professional, particularly if you're going to do it anonymously, because what if someone really isn't well? Yeah. Then you've led yourself down a path of, I can't help you because it's anonymous. So, we really need to be careful about what companies are administering. And often it's very well intentioned, but it won't actually tell you anything.
Very good. Very good. Yeah. And quite often some companies will, well, actually in a lot of organizations, we run a program, we want to run a wellbeing intervention, and more often than not, it's the people that are already well that will come along to that, whatever it is we're organizing, let's say. How do we encourage those that maybe perhaps need the intervention the most to engage with it?
So my view is you need to give them the why. Because if you don't give people the why, then why would I engage with it? So let's say, I don't know, I'm a 25 stone builder and you come on my construction site and you say, there you go, there's your subsidized gym membership. I currently don't go to the gym. I've no intention of going to the gym. Yeah. Why are you giving me a gym membership? Like, okay, maybe I'll give it to my son, or maybe I'll give it to my daughter, but I'm not going to use that, Whereas if you say the reason we're giving you the subsidized gym membership is because we care about your health and you need to be fit to do the job that we're asking you to do, and we want to support you in your fitness levels, but also that bad back that you've been complaining about for a few years, there's a physio at that gym that could help support you with specific exercises that would encourage much better back health, and that's going to support you for the rest of your life, whether you're still with this company or not. It's putting it in a way that people understand the why. Just giving people the option. If they're not taking it already, they're not going to take it just because you give it to them. Whereas if you can explain and give them a reason to take it. So like with healthy eating, for example, most people know now that eating healthily is good for you. I don't think there's anyone on the planet that can go, oh, really? Like, I thought McDonald's was going to be everything. So if you subsidize healthy meal choices, most people will take that healthy meal choice, and not just because it's cheaper, but because they get, oh, this is good for me, this will make me feel better, this will help me sleep better, this will support maintaining a healthy weight, etc. They kind of understand the reasons, and it's very quick to explain the why. Whereas if you just go in and you put free fruit out, the people who like fruit will take the free fruit. Or actually the research says a lot of people take it home. So, people will get their kids' lunch boxes sorted, that kind of thing. but you're right. If you're not someone that would automatically reach for a banana over a biscuit, just having it available isn't enough. You need to explain, actually, biscuits can upset your blood sugar level, whereas banana is quicker release energy. So you'll still get an energy boost, but it's far less likely to drop significantly afterwards. Someone might be like, oh, I get why you're offering me that now. So for me, the why is so important. The why is almost more important than the offering, because if you give people the information, they can make that choice.
So start with why. Simon Sinek, I love that approach. And there's actually a really, I love it, a small company in Ireland called Food Choice at Work, and they kind of adopt that approach that you're talking about there. They provide education up front on food choices, healthy eating, and the benefits you can get from these particular food choices. But they also match the education with in the workplace canteen. It's all based on nudge theory. The healthy choice is the easy choice. Maybe, as you say, the healthy options are a little bit more subsidized than the slightly unhealthier options. But the choice is there. The unhealthy options are still there. Maybe they're kind of hidden down low or something in the fridge kind of idea. So it's just that nudge theory plus education plus the healthy choice is the easy choice.
Definitely.
Steph, you've been so generous with your time. How you're incredibly busy, I can tell. How do you dedicate time to your own well-being, or do you?
Yeah, I absolutely do. So I realized very early on in my career that I was no use to man a beast if I wasn't looking after myself. And one of those very famous sayings is, you can't pour from an empty cup. So if I've nothing left to give, I'm no use to my patients, to my clients, to the companies I'm working with. And I do a huge amount of kind of burnout coaching and supporting individuals with preventing and managing and lifting themselves out of burnout, and kind of just really helping people get their stuff together. If they're feeling very overwhelmed and life's kind of taken over a little bit, how do they bring themselves back to themselves? And you can't really do that kind of work unless you're doing it yourself, because just the level of hypocrisy you feel, like you guilt trip yourself. Sometimes you hear yourself giving advice and you're like, that's really good advice, I should be doing that. So I definitely make the time. I think being a psychologist, I find in my line of work, people either exercise or drink. And I'm definitely an exerciser. So I make a lot of time to go to the gym. It kind of sets me up. It's good for my mental health. It's good for my mood. I really like that time where it's just me and my headphones, and no one really needs anything from me at the gym, and I think everyone should have a space in their day that's just for them. And also I got really interested in mood and food from quite a young age. So I was diagnosed as hypoglycemic when I was a teenager, which is it's kind of like a blood sugar management issue, and I actually managed to kind of out exercise and out diet that problem for myself, just by making tweaks and understanding mood and food and how different things were going to make me feel. And I know that I thrive and perform at my best, and my well-being is at its best when I'm putting good fuel in my body and really taking care of myself. And so I'd say the two well-being areas that I make the most time for are the basics, so their movement and their fuel, so kind of exercise and food, but they really set me up. So if those are slipping, I know something's gone wrong.
Brilliant. Yeah, movement and fuel, yeah, so important. But really nicely summarized there. Excellent. Steph, you've been so generous with your time. Where can people go to find out more about you and your work?
So the easiest place to find me is probably Instagram, which is workplace_wellbeing. So I tend not to spam all the time on there. So I tend to do conversations I've had this week at the end of the week, which will just summarize some of the workplace wellbeing chats that I've been having across different organizations. And the other thing is, if it's more writing specific, but on Twitter, I'm at Steph Fitz Writes, and that's just all my kind of writing adventures and nonsense.
Fantastic. And we'll include all those links and details in the show notes that go along with the episode. Stephanie, thanks so much for your time. I've really enjoyed our conversation today.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for your tolerance with the day-to-day window cleaner life cleaning distractions.
Thanks, Steph.
Thanks.
And that's a wrap for this week. Go to workwellpodcast.com if you'd like to access the show notes for this episode. Quick favor to ask. Can you head over to iTunes or Google Play or wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe, rate, and leave a review for the Work Well podcast? It will be a huge help. So thank you. If you want to dive deeper in the area of workplace health promotion, if you want to educate yourself in this area, then make sure to check out the Work Well Institute. It's our online learning hub. It's a one-stop shop for all your workplace well-being training needs. You'll find all the details at workwellinstitute.org. By the way, the original music that you're hearing right now was composed by my good friend, Greg Clifford. Check him out at gregcliffordmusic.com. Thanks for listening right to the end. Remember to work well, stay safe, and I'll see you on the next episode.